Listen up.
Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community. And now, here's your host, Andrew Plaw.
Welcome to another episode of the PowerShell Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Plaw, at Andrew Plaw Tech. We have a very exciting SharePoint-focused episode. I think it's been a while since we covered SharePoint, and we're not only going to hear about SharePoint, we're going to hear about what's coming to the, welcome to the podcast, Gautam Sheth. We'd like you to tell us what we're going to learn about, because there's been some changes to the PowerPoint module. And I believe when I was doing some research on it, you've done a ton of work on this. So what is PnP PowerShell?
Hey, Andrew. Thanks a lot for having me. PnP PowerShell is a PowerShell module that you can use to connect with different Microsoft 365 services, primarily focused on SharePoint, but we also do a lot of stuff related to Microsoft Graphs and Microsoft other 365 services such as Teams, Planner, Entra ID, and lots more, as well as Power Platform as well. So quite a lot of stuff that we do inside this particular module. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have a dev perspective, because I believe your day job's a dev. Is that correct?
Yeah. I work as a developer at Staffbase. So my primary job is working on Microsoft 365 from the developer side of the things. So yeah.
Yeah, which is interesting, because most, I think, people that get into PowerShell initially are more on the administration side of, they'll administer a 365 environment that'll have SharePoint, things like that. Whereas you are someone who's sort of used the Microsoft services as sort of like a platform where now you've built like developer skills on top of it, and you rely sort of on the way they've done things to, I guess, sort of like leveraging libraries. You're able to leverage their platform as sort of like building blocks for dev stuff. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's a good assessment on that. So yeah, I primarily started working on SharePoint, on premise, just so you had servers and all of that, and we could access them, and we had all those things. And now, once you move to the cloud, you have to do a bunch of stuff related to services-oriented architecture and all of those things. So that's how my journey started. So it was primarily as a full-time backend .NET developer, and now it's more transitioning to a cloud developer kind of role. So yeah.
How long have you been developing?
Yeah, developing since I went out of college. So primarily around 10, 12 years experience on the development side of the things. So mostly focused on .NET initially, and now a mix of both. So .NET as well as the front-end side of the things, like the Node.js ecosystem. So yeah, both of them. And of course, we have the DevOps side of the things as well. So that's all part of the system as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, I want to dive into all this a lot more. I want to get to know you a little bit more. I want to talk about how people could be using SharePoint and sort of click it into the bigger picture. But welcome to the podcast. Let's I guess, take a beat here. Thanks for joining. I know we're in way different time zones. I didn't know time zones could get 30 minutes difference. I thought it was always on the hour. I learned that today. I was almost late because of it, but I really do appreciate your flexibility. For those that don't know, it's kind of holiday time, so I know you're traveling around. So thanks for being community oriented and joining us here.
Thanks, Andrew, for having me as well. Yeah, time zones. Well, developers and time zones, a love story written in the stars. So for sure. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah. I'm just curious, as a dev who's been working in the 365 world for a bit, there's been some changes over the years. For your experience as a dev, does it feel like it's a fun platform to dev for? Does it feel like it's gotten better over the years, or is there a lot more overhead now? Or what's your impression on things?
Yeah, so as a dev, a lot of opportunities have opened up, not just in backend, but also on the front end side of the thing. So you have to kind of, build upon your skill set. So just being, I started myself as a pure .NET developer. We used to build everything from the UI to the backend, everything inside .NET, using the clickety designer and all that stuff. And now we do a mix of all of those things. So it's kind of work in progress in a way. So, and of course, as you progress in the industry, you grow your skills and stuff. So that's how I view that journey as well. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And cloud presents its own challenges. In the earlier times, we had on-premise and we used to do all the administration and all of that work. The cloud does, how do I put it this way, lowers that kind of complexity, especially in the Microsoft 365 side of the things. So yeah.
Yeah. Do you still code for fun, or now that you're a professional? Yeah. What type of hobby projects are you into?
PnP PowerShell primarily. So that's what I love doing. That I started my open source journey into that because in my previous job, I used to work as a SharePoint consultant, and there we used to leverage a bunch of open source .NET libraries. Targeted towards Microsoft 365, and we used to find a bunch of bugs and all of that. So I started my journey fixing some of those bugs, and that's how I started my role into this contribution side of the things to open source. So yeah.
So PnP PowerShell, you're a dev who with a background in .NET. So why are you looking at something like PnP PowerShell and trying to use SharePoint from PowerShell?
Thank Microsoft. Let's put it that way. So the one that PowerShell module that has been provided by Microsoft is primarily focused more towards the, how do I put it this way, SharePoint admin, tenant admin kind of roles, whereas the one that I work on, the PnP PowerShell, it targets a bunch of different roles as well. So it can be used by site administrators and people who have somewhat lower privileges instead of the tenant admin privileges that are necessary to execute the SharePoint module. So that's how PnP PowerShell is built. So anybody who is not a tenant admin, SharePoint tenant admin, let's put it that way. So even if they are not they don't have those permissions, they can use the PnP PowerShell module to perform operations against SharePoint sites as well as teams and all those kind of things. So yeah.
Okay, and you're working on that module. Do you know what is PnP? So I see there's an organization called PnP, and then the project is just called PowerShell. You can check it out, pnp.github.io/PowerShell. But what do you know about the PnP org?
So Vesa Yuvunen, he's one of the product managers in Microsoft. He started this initiative called the Patterns and Practices Initiative. Now it is slightly renamed towards, let's call it this way, Microsoft 365 community. It's kind of renamed from Patterns and Practices towards more, so that it's a bit more inclusive of everything. So it becomes Microsoft 365 community is that. So that's how it's kind of part of that community there. So the module is part of that community. So yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's pretty helpful. I don't know, how would you be a SharePoint admin without a module like this? Like, what's the alternative?
I think you have to write your own. You have to write your own code. So SharePoint provides its own object model, and you need to build everything on top of that. So you need to write your own scripts and all of that. So it's kind of a complex job. You really need to know the object model and how it functions and all of that. And PnP PowerShell kind of lowers that complexity. It wraps all of that inside inside the module, and we expose the part which makes sense to the admins to operate upon. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so basically, if you were to administer this without the PnP PowerShell module, you would basically have to be like almost dev level of experience with things. Cool. And how do you go about looking at the object model? You mentioned an object model. What is an object model?
So object model is how you will execute operations against, say, a SharePoint site collection. So that's how they have a documentation, and a lot of stuff is kind of in memory now because we have been working on that for quite some time. But yeah, it's how you go about executing operations. For example, we have SharePoint, we have document library. So inside that document library, you want to upload a file. So you need to use that SharePoint object model to upload that thing. Now, if you are a dev, you can look into you need the whole development environment set up, Visual Studio and all of that kind of things. But as an IT admin, you don't necessarily know all that stuff, and you also need to kind of go into that dev side of the things to execute just uploading of that file. Whereas PnP PowerShell kind of lowers that complexity by just making it available as a command. So yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's similar to like other objects where there's sort of properties and methods that you can go about getting things done.
Yeah.
It's always interesting for me as a non-programmer background, and sort of learn PowerShell. And that was my introduction to a lot of this. It's sort of always interesting to see those patterns that you see in multiple places, and sometimes they're called different things slightly. I'm sure in the dev world you see that all the time as you're maybe trying new languages and seeing new stuff. It all sort of borrows from each other.
Yeah.
Awesome. So there is a lot there. And I think if people out there have SharePoint in their environments, they should certainly check out getting a handle of it. using something like PnP PowerShell. But are there any concepts that are unique to this module that'll be helpful for people to know before they start using it? Any unique way the commands should be called or anything like that is helpful?
Uh, See, the primary, I mean, it follows all the PowerShell conventions that you have. So for the basic starting place is you need authentication in place. So everything starts with authentication. So you need Entra ID. You need to create an app inside Entra ID, and then you use that particular Entra ID app with the permissions that you want to set on that app, and then you use that to connect to Microsoft 365 and different things inside Microsoft 365 like SharePoint and Teams, Planner, etc. So yeah,
Yeah.
the primary starting point would be like basic connect PnP online. So if you have used the Microsoft Graph module or I think the Azure modules, you have the connect AZ account or you have the connect MG Graph. It's kind of similar to that. So you use connect PnP online, and that's how you get started with the PnP module.
Cool. And I'm thinking about your workflow.
Mhm.
So are you like, as a dev, I imagine you're creating projects and they are creating things. Are these for like clients or these internal?
So right now, I primarily focus as a hobbyist on this side of the things. But in my previous job, I used to use that heavily, quite a lot for our customers and our products as well. So the role here in the PnP PowerShell was that people wanted to use because it is so very popular. You have SharePoint. You have a SharePoint site collection, and you want to have an exact copy of that site collection. So that's where PnP PowerShell kind of really shines through. So it can extract the site structure, the schema, the security settings, the configurations, and everything that you might require in a SharePoint site collection, and basically copy it over to a different site collection. And that's how you could do a lot of automation using this particular module. And that's how you find certain issues. You go about doing stuff around that. So yeah.
Wow. So you really do just support this project because you are community oriented, right? From what you were just saying, you're not in it every day using it as a SharePoint dev these days.
Yeah, not these days, but in the past couple of years, I used to use it super heavily. So yeah, that's how I came to contribute to that and stuff. So yeah.
Very cool. Well, I appreciate that. And you are a Microsoft MVP, so it's always cool to see that.
Yeah.
But what are you doing these days, if not PowerPoint? Is it more graph stuff? I think you mentioned that a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So my primary focus nowadays is a bit more on the front end side of the Microsoft 365. So we use the Graph APIs to build cool UX and UI stuff inside our own platform that we have. So that's where my primary focus is nowadays. So yeah.
So you've spent
Uh,
some time seeing what's available in the Graph API.
yeah.
There's a
That,
lot, a lot, a lot.
that's yeah. It's a huge surface. So yeah, yeah, for sure.
Okay. But we're going back in time just a little bit because I'm trying to make some comparisons.
Mhm.
I think that Graph is so we talked about like there's different building blocks and you can dev on top of the 365 or Azure stuff, right? That's cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it seems like that's sort of what the Graph API on its own. I mean, obviously that still like connects with the different components, but it seems like getting really familiar with the Graph API is going to serve you really well in your career, both as someone maybe more on the administration side, but also on someone more on the dev side, in my opinion, from what I'm seeing. I mean, this is sort of the future of interacting with 365 stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, that's completely true. I mean, the PnP PowerShell had what you call is primarily focused on the SharePoint APIs, but now as more and more APIs are migrated towards Graph, we kind of also do some sort of internal migration around that as well. And Graph, as you know, is like a single endpoint which you can use to connect to different services, and that's really important. That's where the Microsoft 365 dev as well as extensibility is kind of going towards for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it makes sense for that approach because then they can dedicate more efforts into just the Graph API instead of like these sort of all these different projects that maybe are supported to varying degrees. Shout out to everybody out there who's sort of suffered from interacting with one of those maybe not as maintained things out there in the ecosystem. But okay. Are there any interesting endpoints that you've seen or that you think are fun or curious or maybe not so much for work stuff, but if you have like a test environment, something to play around with in the Graph API? Because there's just so many. I've seen some things with teams and stuff where kind of got my mind thinking about some interesting stuff you can do. But is there anything that comes to your mind?
Primarily, the your graph has also its own, quirks and all of that. So you need to use certain headers for certain endpoints, and that's always the tricky part. Sometimes, for example, the user's endpoint, and if you need to have an actual, proper, let's call it sanitized data about certain reports, you need to use certain headers to fetch that data. So that's where, yeah, that's always interesting. And other interesting part would be the throttling side of the thing. So if you do bulk operations or certain things, you often run into throttling limits and all of that. So uh, testing those limits out is also quite an interesting challenge for us as a dev. So that's also I love doing that. So yeah.
Awesome. People want to get started with PnP PowerShell. I believe you said use connect PnP online. That's a great place you have to do it, I guess, to actually use any other command. But after that, they're connected. Oh, yay, everything's good. What are a couple commands they should check out? Maybe some get commands that'll return some interesting things they can start working with. What are a couple good starter commands?
Yeah, so get so connect PnP online is, like as I said, the starting point, and then you can use that for different surfaces. For you can use it for SharePoint. So if you want a list of SharePoint sites, you can use the get PnP tenant site. If you want the details about a particular site collection, you can use the get PnP site. If you want to use if you see, we have quite a lot of things around copying stuff as well. So if you want to, there is a SharePoint list, and you want to copy that list from one site collection to another, you can use the copy PnP list as well. So that's something that you can use quite a lot of these commands around SharePoint. So yeah.
I've heard this rumor before. Oh, sorry. You can give us more if you have one. Oh, I was going to say, I've heard this rumor before that everything in 365 is SharePoint on the back end. I know that's not literally true, but is it true that there's sort of like the SharePoint approach to implementing other things in 365 where it is SharePoint in the background? I think Teams was one that I heard, like some things are technically just SharePoint sites. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of true. The Teams chats, they are stored somewhere, I think in some Cosmos DB or somewhere. But for example, certain things like SharePoint, the files that you upload, they are often stored inside a document library in SharePoint. There are private channels. So whenever you create a private channel, it will always create a SharePoint site collection somewhere in your tenant as well. So a lot of parts are kind of the backend of Teams, so that's where SharePoint is nowadays. So yeah,
it's cool to see. I mean, I guess it makes sense, right? If you're going to make something, you might I mean, I don't know if it's considered dog fooding it here, where you eat your own dog food kind of thing, but it makes sense, right? If you're building things as if they're building blocks, you should use them as building blocks and not do sort of random stuff. But I just say that to highlight how important SharePoint is.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to see how, because the evolution of Microsoft 365 cloud as such, initially it was just SharePoint, then we got introduced to Teams, and how they had to even scale the Teams platform itself, and how they've leveraged the SharePoint as well in that particular scale. So that's an interesting thing to see. So yeah,
that is the PnP SharePoint module. I keep almost saying PowerPoint instead of SharePoint. Because it's a little earlier in the day over here, not too early, but I need a little coffee. I keep stopping myself. Do you ever make that mistake? Is that a thing in the SharePoint world to almost say PowerPoint or to confuse it, or is that just me?
Yeah, it's just you.
It's a very me thing. So glad to know.
Yeah.
So in terms of recent changes, I know you've put a bunch of work. Are there any in particular changes that you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, so right now we are probably not now, but in the coming couple of weeks, we plan to launch a new version of PnP PowerShell. We want to call it V3 version. So that's something that we have built based on .NET 8. The reason we had to kind of do that is because .NET 6 is now kind of out of support in November. So that's we anyway have to kind of move away from the things that are not supported. So .NET 8 is something that we support, and now it will also be only supported on PowerShell 7.4 or later versions of PowerShell 7.4. So that's the big change that we have been doing. And besides that, we have done quite a lot of changes overall in the main authentication side of the things. So as I mentioned, connect with PnP online is like the main command that probably everyone uses. What used to happen is users used to provide credentials. The get credentials. You used to enter the username and the password, and that's how we would authenticate to Microsoft 365. But we have moved of that away from the credentials method to the interactive flow. That's a big change. Primarily, we did that because nowadays there's a lot of focus on security, compliance, multi-factor authentication, and keeping in mind all of those changes, we decided to change the default from credentials to interactive mode of authentication. So that's something that we did. We also got rid of pop-ups, because initially what used to happen is when you use Connect PnP online with certain parameters, it would open a pop-up, and that pop-up was kind of super old, based on super old legacy tech, which is Internet Explorer engine. So we buried Internet Explorer a long time back, and we don't want the ghosts of that coming up again. So we decided to get rid of that pop-up thingy, and now we just plain open a browser, and you open the browser, and you click on submit, and it opens the authentication flow. So that's something that we did primarily. So yeah.
Those authentication flows. It's always nice when there's a module that has handled it, because it can be a little tricky at times, especially the first time you get it working. So glad to hear that's working well.
Yeah, so we also did a lot of improvements around, throttling and all of that kind of things. So a lot of people use PnP PowerShell in a huge automation scenario, and they use it against to make bulk operations against the graph endpoints or against SharePoint endpoints and all of that. And they would often run into the limits of the API, so they would often run into 429 errors or 503 errors and all of that. So now we improved quite a lot, because we have now enabled rate limiting support as well for that. So that's an interesting thing that we implemented, and we have turned that on by default. So yeah.
So people have some rate limiting, they can't get themselves locked out or in any trouble. That is helpful, and that is awesome, and I appreciate you highlighting that. And people can check it out. I'll have links to all of this. You can check out is version 3 out yet for PnP PowerShell?
It's part of the nightly builds. So we always release nightly builds every night. So yeah, they can check out the nightly builds, and they'll be able to use the latest stuff. So as I mentioned in the caveats, so they need to use PowerShell 7.4, and they'll be good to go. So yeah.
Awesome. And I guess if they run into anything on the nightly builds, they can open up an issue on that project. Links to everything will be there. Awesome. And appreciate your and everyone else's work who put a lot of time into this to really, for a lot of people, I don't know if they would have the time or technical expertise at this current moment to be able to do what you all have done. And now they're able to take your hard work, open source, and use it at their job and be able to do things that literally they couldn't have done before. So that is really cool. And it's always great to highlight that and see that in the community at large, the PowerShell world, and the open source place, and GitHub, anywhere. It's always good to see. So appreciate your contributions to that. And everyone out there can get started. I mean, I think if you're in a situation where you're responsible for SharePoint and you're not interacting with it, like through PowerShell or something like that, you're going to be in a pretty tough spot, especially as time goes on. But we talked about Power Automate, or at least you mentioned it earlier. And I'm very curious how, and it sounds like this is probably from a previous job. I think your previous role where you're working sort of in that role. But how does Power Automate fit into like creating something? Like what would you use Power Automate for as a dev?
See, this is something that I've not done that, but this is a community contribution. So a bunch of folks created these commands, and we merged those commands as part of the module. So that's what we do. But a lot of people use the Power Automate to basically check the status of the Power Automate run, or to export certain flows and move from one environment to another, and all those kind of things. And the best part is that this is cross-platform, so they can use it on Mac, Linux, Windows machines, all of them. It will work the same. So you don't need a specific, Windows. PowerShell has that kind of reputation, that it's like Windows only, but it's not actually true nowadays because of PowerShell 7 and later versions. So that's where this really shines, So yeah, they can have the same dev workflows across operating systems as well. So yeah.
Now I want to know about, how did you run into PowerShell? You said you were into .NET for a little bit, building everything by hand, and then you got into some 365 stuff. Where did you meet PowerShell, and what was your initial impression?
Yeah. So as I said, I started my job as a SharePoint developer, and in SharePoint developers had their own servers in that scenario, because it was all on-premise environment, and we used to have PowerShell by default, because there were certain things that we needed to use PowerShell for to deploy certain solutions, and that's how I got kind of introduced to PowerShell. And then things started moving towards the cloud, and there we started a slightly different object model, and that kind of something clicked for me, and I found out a bunch of certain issues related to uh, PnP PowerShell, because this is a quite old project, around 7-8 years old, and that's how I started running, because I used to use PowerShell quite a lot, PnP PowerShell as well quite a lot, and I ran into a bunch of issues in my own job, and I decided, like, hey, how can I help this project, or how can I fix that particular issue? And that's how I started my contributions into that. And then I saw that this PnP PowerShell was built completely on .NET and C#, and that's kind of where my skill set kind of fit in. So that's how I started my contributions as well. So yeah.
Okay. So primarily your contributions in PowerShell are community oriented in the SharePoint world. You're not in day-to-day, your go-to terminal isn't PowerShell. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say. Yeah.
What's your go-to?
The front-end ecosystem, the Node.js ecosystem. Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Interesting. Do you like PowerShell? Or are there things about it that you don't like, I should say?
No, I don't have any such particular thing which I don't like. I just like the automation part of that, because the thing is, you can't scale UI UX. You need automation. If you want scale, you need automation, and that's where PowerShell is there. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that is always insightful. It's always interesting to hear, because I think like what you're mentioning about PowerShell, oh, now it's cross-platform, but people think about it as a Windows thing. I think that's like so true for all tools. Like as time goes on, they change, and their identity can change, and the way we hold them in our mind can change. And that's true for PowerShell. It's true for all kinds of different things. So always a good idea to keep your eyes open for things as they continue to get better. And if you're going to have a career in IT or dev or whatever, for me, I enjoy seeing the tool sets get better. Like to see where Azure is now compared to 10 years ago, and same thing with 365, that is really cool. Same thing with PowerShell and all these other things. Like a lot of people are putting in a ton of work to make this stuff better, and we get to benefit from it and get paid technically, right? That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and the beauty of PowerShell and PowerShell it being cross-platform is, see, we are a bunch of 5 people who help maintain this module, and all of them are in slightly different time zones, and some of them use the Mac OS, and they build the whole module on that particular platform, and that's how it's kind of a dog-fooding thing that you mentioned a bit earlier. Like you use the product on the different operating system and see how that works, and then you use that on Windows, and it's really cool to see the evolution of the whole ecosystem as such.
Are there any trends in IT that you're looking forward to, or any predictions you have for 5 years from now? And I guess it can be in the dev space or the Azure space. Any changes you see?
I love the AI space nowadays. So Copilot everywhere. It sounds a bit of too much, but Copilot does seem to be everywhere nowadays, and I think we'll have to. It's just the beginning of the whole new AI stuff that we are going to see. So yeah, I would definitely keep my eye on that and start working as well towards that side of the things for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, the data science side of things is very confusing on the AI side of things.
Yeah.
But I've found that it's easy to start taking advantage of GitHub Copilot at the very least. I've done some fun stuff in there, and just for the way my brain works, I don't like remembering little things that are not of consequence. I like thinking about the bigger pieces. And Copilot and AI in general really allows me to I know what I'm looking for. I don't want to write 12 lines. I know I could. It's kind of simple stuff. Okay, building blocks. We press tab and we keep it going. For me, it keeps my head in that space of thinking and solving the problem, and not in just like mindless keystrokes, which super valuable.
Yeah, I mean, GitHub Copilot is so nowadays in kind of invaluable. You use that to generate commit messages and generate documentation, certain tests, all of that kind of stuff. It's practically everywhere nowadays. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm also interested to see, as the tool is out there longer, not just GitHub Copilot, but just AI in general to see if there are any novel or interesting attacks that hackers go for, like maybe poisoning data sources. I don't know, but there's always like the cat and mouse game. I'm very curious to see if there's anything that transpires in that space over the next 5 years, because people are going to try, I'd imagine. Now, outside of tech, what are you into? What's a cool hobby you like, or outside of the tech world, what is something cool? You a big soccer fan or football fan?
Cricket. So cricket fan, the game, let me call it that way. So I love cricket. There is a India versus Australia test series going on, so that's something I'm following quite a lot, quite closely as well. So I love following cricket quite a lot.
Yeah, cricket's awesome. It's super popular. I've never played, but I know it's one of the most popular sports. Have you seen that game where it's like tag and like oh gosh, I'm gonna do a terrible job explaining it, but like you have like two zones. Do you know what I'm talking about? No.
Nope.
No.
Sorry.
And I would try and explain it for 5 minutes and still never be able to think of the name.
Okay.
But yeah, I've been trying to, I like different sports. There's all kinds of weird little hobby sports, and I'm always getting into them for like 2 months in a row and then getting like not good, but like good enough, and then kind of moving on.
Yeah.
But it's always nice to have things outside of tech. Could you make us a song recommendation? I like asking my guests random questions, and songs are just one that I like. I like getting a little flavor of the different types of music people are into. And you don't have to choose it right now. I can just put it in the show notes as a mystery song if you don't have it selected.
Okay. There is a Bollywood. I primarily listen to Bollywood music, so I'll send you the link for that. There is a song Kalank, and that's what I listen to nowadays. So yeah.
Nice, awesome. Well, I'm adding that to my playlist. Oh, that's a good idea. I should do a playlist with like all the songs people have recommended. That would be funny.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, I want to ask you some questions that I ask everybody. We call them the common parameters, sort of reflect on life and your career. So first question is, what is one time something went wrong and how did you handle it?
Yeah. I think it was quite a couple of years ago. But again, SharePoint world, SharePoint on-premise world, and I really botched up user migration, and it turns out that quite a lot of students in a certain university in Netherlands, they couldn't access their SharePoint site collection. So that's something, I did. Luckily for me, there was help available for me as well. So we managed to fix that quite a lot. And there was a missing issue with identity. So it's always a complex topic, and I kind of botched up in certain things related to claims and all that, and nobody could access certain things. So but we managed to fix that with the help of PowerShell for sure, and with the help of my colleagues. So that's something that happened some time ago. So
Gosh, were you sweating? Was it a really stressful day? Yeah,
really stressful.
That's always
Imagine thousands of students locked out and they're not able to do anything because somebody did a bad job at some migration. And that's life.
Yeah, migrations are scary, but I'm glad you had help and survived. That changeover time period is always high stress for sure.
Yeah.
All right. What is one tip you would give your younger self when starting out?
Be curious nowadays. Be open and look into the internals of things. How stuff really works. If certain things doesn't make sense, ask your seniors for help or try to do it yourself. Nowadays we have super useful tools like Copilot and ChatGPT and stuff. But even if you don't have it, you should just look into the internals and see how things actually work. And that's how that's what I would do. So
And I think PowerShell is a great entry point into exploring and diving into things and poking around, right? It kind of gives you a mechanism to poke these different parts of a system without having to be in the GUI, because not everything is available that way. And sometimes you can circumvent things. Yeah, that's a great tip.
Yeah, and I really like certain tools like Fiddler, so you can check the network traffic and see what parameters are used, how the authentication works, what all headers, all of that stuff. That's something that's super useful, especially in Microsoft 365 side of the things to really look into the internals. So yeah.
That's a huge recommendation. I'm going to reiterate it for those out there. If you've never used Fiddler, if you haven't, it's very helpful to know that it exists. It's even more helpful to install it on a test machine at the very least and actually explore what's going on with these web requests. Because I think that's what you're saying. Like you can actually like click on a button on your web browser, click on a link. All right. It sends a REST API request and you can see that packet in the parameters. So if you're trying to figure out how to replicate something in automation using PowerShell, you're able to just click through naturally and see what's kind of being used on their covers. And the way that things are developed is like a bunch of websites are created that way and like interact with each other that way through a REST API. So there's a ton you can do there. And understanding how that works, and like I said earlier, it's like how a ton of the internet works. So you understand so much more. And it's not just this magical black box kind of thing where you push a button and some magic happens. It actually kind of makes sense. So good advice there. And honestly, my favorite part about PowerShell is just learning more, poking around, diving in. Such a good entry point for that. Because prior to it, like, as someone who was in help desk, just answering tickets, not super technical background, that was my entry point into learning that stuff. It's like, I have to solve the day job, and I can just research a little bit more afterwards. And it's kind of an enjoyable thing. And you get more skills and you actually learn the stuff. So yeah, you get me fired up. I love that stuff. All right. So you gave us Fiddler, and I'll even include a link to that. Why not? But do you use PowerShell enough to have 3 favorite modules? I know we got PnP PowerShell.
Yeah. I love the Azure module. I also love I forgot. No, I wouldn't call it favorite, but I really love the Azure module. So yeah, that's a second one. So I don't have a third one, but PnP PowerShell and Azure, that's like the both of them are kind of good to have. Don't particularly like the graph module because it's more like, it's an SDK. So you need to build your own module from that SDK because that's how it has been built. But Azure is really good, and PnP PowerShell. So, yeah, highly recommend.
Awesome. Gautam, thank you for joining me. And everybody out there, if you're walking, if you're driving to work, you're driving home, be safe. And thank you for joining us. Gautam, it's been a pleasure, my friend. Do you have any message? Do you have a message for the people before you say goodbye?
Firstly, thanks, Andrew, for having me. It was a really good conversation to have with you, and good to meet you as well, first time. To all the listeners out there, wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. Be safe and drive carefully. Yeah.
Yes, and Happy New Year, because this is actually going to be coming out in 2025. So, woo! Hope everybody's having a fantastic year. People have enjoyed what you've had to say. They want to connect with you on the internet. Where can we find you on the World Wide Web?
You can primarily find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Both of them are there. And nowadays also Blue Sky as well. So all of them, you can reach out to me in either of these platforms. So yeah.
Hey, well, I don't have you. I'm not following you on Blue Sky. So I'll get on that next. And thank you, everybody out there. Thank you so much. Leave us a like, comment, subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review. Share it with your friends, your coworkers, that person who should be learning PowerShell but isn't. Maybe that your SharePoint admin. Maybe they could learn a thing or two from this episode. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gautam.
Thank you. Hey.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast. The PowerShell Podcast is a PDQ production, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.